I said it as a throwaway line, the kind of thing you say to a stranger nursing a drink alone at a bar when you're killing 45 minutes before your own miserable obligation starts. She was sitting 2 stools down, checking her phone every 90 seconds with the specific anxious energy of someone dreading whatever came next, tapping one finger against her glass in a rhythm that suggested nerves rather than boredom. I'd noticed her the second I walked in, mostly because the bar was otherwise nearly empty on a Tuesday evening, and something about her posture, braced, alert, clearly rehearsing an exit strategy for a conversation that hadn't even started yet, struck me as worth a small kindness. "You're too beautiful to be alone tonight," I said. "Whoever's got you checking your phone like that clearly doesn't know what they're missing." She looked up, something complicated moving behind her eyes, and said the sentence that changed the entire trajectory of my evening. "I wish it were you." "Excuse me?" "Nothing. Ignore me. I'm having a strange night." She managed a small, tired laugh, setting her phone face down on the bar like she was trying to physically distance herself from whatever it represented. "I'm actually about to meet someone, blind date, arranged by my mother, who's apparently decided I've been single long enough that drastic measures were warranted. I don't know a single thing about him except that he's supposedly perfect for me, which is exactly the kind of confidence that's historically preceded my worst dating disasters. I'm Julian Aldridge, 33, and I want it on the record that I laughed at that, genuinely, because I was sitting in that exact bar for the exact same reason. My own mother, working in apparent collaboration with a family friend I hadn't seen in years, had arranged a date I'd been dreading all week, armed with nothing but a first name and a description so vague it could have applied to half the city. "That's a genuinely strange coincidence," I said. "I'm actually here for the same reason. Blind date, mother's arrangement. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes trying to work up the nerve to actually go through with it." "Small world," she said, still not fully looking at me, checking her phone again. "What's your date's name, if you don't mind me asking? Maybe I can offer some moral support from someone in the same boat." "Wren, that's all I've got. Wren, apparently perfect for me, according to 2 mothers who've clearly overestimated their own matchmaking abilities." She went very still, phone forgotten in her hand, staring at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. "My name is Wren," she said slowly, "and I'm looking for a man named Julian." We stared at each other for a long, absurd moment, the specific comedic horror of 2 people realizing the stranger they'd been casually chatting with for the past 10 minutes was actually the exact obligation they'd both been dreading all week. "You have got to be kidding me," I said. "I genuinely wish I were. This is either the most romantic coincidence of my entire life or the most mortifying, and I currently cannot determine which. Can we agree it's possibly both? I feel like that's the only honest assessment available to either of us right now." "Fine, both, though I reserve the right to fully revise that assessment depending on how the rest of this evening goes. Here's what you need to know about Wren Ellery before anything else happens. She's 29, works as a museum curator specializing in textile history, and has, according to what she told me over the next several increasingly surreal minutes, been actively resisting her mother's matchmaking attempts for the better part of 2 years, mostly because every previous arrangement had ended in some variation of spectacular incompatibility. She described, at some length, a date from the previous spring who'd spent the entire dinner discussing his fantasy football league in a level of detail that had apparently made her briefly consider faking a medical emergency to escape, and another who'd shown up 40 minutes late without apology or explanation, treating the entire evening as an inconvenience he was generously enduring. "So you can understand," she said, "why I walked into tonight with fairly low expectations, and why finding out I'd already been talking to my actual date for 20 minutes without either of us realizing it felt like some kind of cosmic joke at my specific expense. Her mother and my mother, it turned out, had been friends since college, reconnected at a reunion 8 months earlier, and had apparently spent considerable time since then quietly engineering exactly this evening, without either of us having the faintest idea the other existed." "I need a minute," Wren said, setting her phone down entirely now. I need to process the fact that I just told a complete stranger I wished he was my blind date, and then discovered he actually is my blind date, in what has to be the single strangest 10 minutes of my dating history. For what it's worth, the compliment stands. I meant it before I knew who you were, which I think actually makes it more meaningful, not less. Does it, though? Or does it just make this whole evening feel like some cosmic prank at both our expense? I want to be honest about the next part because it matters for how the rest of this evening went. There was a version of this moment where we could have simply proceeded as planned, moved to the reserved table our mothers had arranged, gone through the motions of a first date, now armed with the awkward knowledge of how it had actually started. We didn't do that. Instead, we sat at that bar for another 2 hours, still on our original stools, talking with the specific, unguarded honesty of two people who'd already skipped past the nervous small talk phase by accident. We covered an enormous amount of ground in those 2 hours. Her work restoring a 19th century wedding gown for an upcoming exhibit, my own job managing logistics for a mid-sized shipping company, the specific mutual exhaustion of being the last unmarried sibling in families that measured success primarily through relationship milestones. She told me about a research trip to a textile archive in Belgium that had nearly derailed her entire career trajectory when she'd fallen in love with historical preservation over the more lucrative curatorial track her professors had pushed her toward. I told her about 6 months spent working logistics in an actual warehouse before working my way into the management role I held now, a detail I rarely shared on dates because it usually invited condescension I'd grown tired of managing. "You don't strike me as someone who'd be condescending about warehouse work," she said when I mentioned my usual hesitation. "For what it's worth, I appreciate that. Most people hear logistics manager and assume an office job from day one, and get visibly disappointed to learn otherwise. I think people who've actually built something from the ground floor tend to be more interesting than people who started at the top. Occupational hazard of my own field, probably. Textile restoration teaches you to respect the unglamorous labor underneath anything beautiful. Can I tell you something slightly unhinged?" Wren said, somewhere around hour 2, considerably more relaxed than the anxious woman I'd first noticed checking her phone. "I think I'm glad this happened the way it did. If I'd walked into that reserved table knowing you were my arranged date, I'd have spent the whole dinner performing, trying to seem interesting, trying to seem like the version of myself that photographs well on paper for two mothers' matchmaking satisfaction. Instead, I got to just be tired and honest with a stranger who happened to say something kind, and it turned out the stranger was you anyway. I know what you mean. I think I've been dreading tonight for a week specifically because arranged dates always feel like an audition. This didn't feel like an audition at all. No. It felt like just talking to someone I actually wanted to talk to, which is apparently a rarer experience than either of our mothers seemed to understand. We eventually did make our way to the reserved table, mostly because the restaurant staff had grown visibly confused about why the two people meant to be seated together kept sitting at the bar instead. But by the time we actually sat down for the official portion of the date, something fundamental had already shifted. We weren't performing a first meeting anymore. We were simply continuing a conversation that had already proven entirely by accident that we genuinely liked each other. The hostess, when she finally approached us with visible relief, seemed almost puzzled by our lack of urgency. "Your table's been ready for over an hour," she said. "I wasn't sure if I should interrupt." "We got a little sidetracked," Wren said, glancing at me with the specific amusement of someone still processing the strangeness of the entire evening. Turns out we already knew each other before we knew each other. The hostess looked between us, clearly deciding this explanation required no further clarification, and led us to a small table near the back, considerably quieter than the bustling bar area we'd just left. The shift in setting brought its own small formality with it. Both of us settling into actual menus, actual appetizers, the specific choreography of an official first date now overlaid on top of the accidental one that had already happened. "This feels strange," I admitted, once we'd ordered. "Like we're doing this in the wrong order, meeting properly after we've already established we like each other instead of the other way around." I think most people would kill for this order, honestly. Skip straight past the awkward getting to know you phase and just arrive at the comfortable part. Fair point, I retract my complaint. Dinner continued easily, the conversation flowing with the same unguarded quality it had carried at the bar, both of us occasionally catching each other's eye with a small, private laugh at the sheer improbability of the entire evening. I want to tell you about the napkin because it matters for how this story ends. Somewhere in that first hour at the bar, before either of us knew who the other actually was, Wren had mentioned, in passing, a small textile museum exhibit she was working on. Something about historical wedding customs she found genuinely fascinating, despite her own dating cynicism. I'd grabbed a bar napkin and sketched, badly, a rough approximation of a design she'd described, mostly as a joke about my own terrible drawing skills, and she'd kept it, tucking it into her purse before either of us realized the sketch had been made by the exact man she was supposed to be meeting. "You kept that?" I asked, once she'd shown it to me again at the reserved table, considerably more self-conscious about my drawing abilities now that I understood the full context. I kept it because it made me laugh, genuinely, in a way very few things had that week. I didn't know yet it was going to become evidence in the strangest meet-cute of my life. The date, once we'd relocated to the official table, went considerably better than either mother could have possibly hoped for, though we both agreed, over dessert, that neither of us intended to tell them the full story of how the evening had actually started. "If my mother finds out I was flirting with you for a full hour before I realized who you were," Wren said, "she is never going to let either of us live it down." I can already hear the smugness. Same. My mother's going to consider this personal vindication for every dating decision I've ever made that she's disagreed with. We agreed, that first night, to let our families believe the date had gone exactly as planned. A successful, straightforward arrangement. No mention of the accidental hour at the bar that had actually made the whole thing work. It felt, at the time, like a harmless omission, a private joke between the two of us that belonged to nobody else. The 3 weeks that followed were honestly some of the easiest weeks of dating I'd ever experienced, precisely because they existed entirely outside our family's awareness. We went to a small jazz club Wren knew from her college years, spent an entire Saturday wandering through her museum's off-limits archive while she showed me textile pieces most visitors never got to see up close. Discovered a shared, slightly embarrassing love of terrible reality television that neither of us had previously admitted to anyone. "I have never told another human being that I watch this show," Wren admitted, 3 episodes into a marathon neither of us had planned on having. "You're now the sole keeper of this deeply shameful secret." I contain multitudes, apparently, including the capacity to keep secrets about reality television preferences. "You're safe with me." That's oddly reassuring, given the general chaos of how we actually met. One evening, during that same stretch, she took me to the museum after hours, using her staff key to slip us past the closed sign for a private tour of an exhibit she'd spent 8 months curating, walking me through centuries of wedding traditions with the specific animated passion I'd only glimpsed briefly at the bar that first night. "This one's my favorite," she said, stopping in front of a delicately preserved gown from the 1890s. The bride who wore this married a man her family had arranged for her to meet, an actual documented arranged marriage, and according to her surviving letters, she fell genuinely in love with him within the first month. I used to think that was impossibly quaint, honestly. Arranged love. Working out despite the odds. Feels a little less quaint now, given our own circumstances. Considerably less quaint. I keep thinking about her letters differently since our own accidental version of the same story started unfolding. She traced the edge of the display case, careful not to touch the actual glass. I used to think love needed to start from pure, uncomplicated choice to actually mean something. I'm starting to think the starting conditions matter less than what 2 people actually build once they're standing in the same room. That's a generous, historically informed perspective for someone who spent our first 10 minutes assuming I was an unrelated stranger offering an unsolicited compliment. I'm allowed to update my worldview mid-story. That's sort of the whole point of studying history, honestly. understanding that context always complicates the simple version of events. We fell into an easy rhythm those first weeks, the specific, comfortable momentum of two people who'd already skipped past the nervous early stages by pure accident. I found myself looking forward to her texts throughout the workday, rearranging my schedule around her museum hours without fully admitting to myself how quickly this had all started to matter. That agreement lasted almost 3 weeks, which is roughly how long it took Wren's mother to notice her daughter's newly regular Friday night plans and draw her own conclusions. My mother cornered me at brunch on Sunday, Wren told me, calling in a state of visible frustration a few days later. She'd apparently been talking to your mother, comparing notes, and between the two of them, they've pieced together that we've seen each other considerably more than a standard "it went fine" first date would suggest. She's now telling every relative who will listen that her matchmaking instincts are, quote, undefeated, and has started planning what she's calling the eventual wedding to anyone who'll stand still long enough to hear about it. That's considerably premature. That's what I told her. She didn't listen. I think half my extended family already believes we're engaged, based purely on the confidence of my mother's storytelling. My aunt texted me a venue recommendation yesterday. An actual venue, for a wedding that does not exist. My mother's not much better, for the record. She started referring to you as my future daughter-in-law in conversations with the neighbors, according to my sister, who apparently finds the whole situation endlessly entertaining and has done nothing to correct the record. I felt the specific weight of unwanted pressure settling over what had, until that point, been an easy, private thing between just the two of us. How do you want to handle it? I don't know yet. I think some part of me is furious that she's turned something genuinely ours into her own personal victory lap, before we've even had the chance to figure out what this actually is between us, separate from her expectations. The pressure compounded over the following 2 weeks, family gatherings turning into thinly disguised relationship interrogations, distant relatives asking pointed questions about wedding dates neither of us had remotely discussed, the specific, exhausting weight of two families' expectations pressing down on something that had started as a private, accidental discovery at a bar. I found myself dreading my own mother's phone calls, each one containing some new escalation. A cousin who wanted to know if Wren preferred spring or fall weddings, a family friend already asking about guest list logistics for an event that existed only in collective imagination. I feel like I'm losing the actual thing underneath everyone else's version of it, Wren admitted during one particularly exhausting family dinner where her grandmother had spent 20 minutes describing her own wedding dress in detail, clearly under the impression she was offering useful inspiration. Like the real version of us is getting buried under a story my mother's been telling for weeks that we never actually agreed to. I called my sister that same week, needing an outside perspective on the mounting pressure. It's gotten out of hand, I told her. Every family gathering turns into an interrogation. Wren's aunt sent her a venue recommendation. A venue. For a wedding we haven't even discussed. That does sound exhausting, my sister agreed, but can I ask you something honestly? Is the pressure actually the problem, or is it just making you nervous about a question you haven't let yourself examine yet? Whether you actually want to marry this woman eventually, pressure or not? That's uncomfortably perceptive for an unprompted phone call. I'm allowed to be perceptive. I've watched you date plenty of people over the years, and I've never once heard you talk about anyone the way you talk about Wren. Maybe the actual fix isn't distancing yourself from the pressure. Maybe it's figuring out what you actually feel, clearly enough that the pressure stops mattering either way. When did you get so annoyingly wise? I've always been this wise. You've just never called me during an actual crisis before to find out. I sat with that conversation for days afterward, turning my sister's question over with the same careful attention I'd apparently failed to apply to my own feelings throughout the entire ordeal. I need to tell you something, Wren said one evening, considerably more serious than her usual tone. I've been having a hard time separating what I actually feel for you from what everyone else seems to have already decided we're supposed to feel for each other. I keep wondering if I'm genuinely falling for you, or if I'm just falling into the story my mother's been telling for 3 weeks, because it's easier than fighting the narrative. She was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands instead of at me, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something rawer than I'd heard from her before. "I don't know if I chose you, Julian," she said, "or if I just got tired of fighting the story everyone else already wrote for me. That's not fair to you, I know, but I need to be honest that the question's been sitting in my chest for a week, and I don't have a clean answer for it yet." The words landed harder than I expected, a specific cold weight settling somewhere under my ribs. For the first time since that first night at the bar, I wondered if she genuinely liked me, or if we had both simply mistaken relief. Relief at being handed an easy answer to a question we'd both been avoiding, for something that actually deserved the word love. I'd spent 3 weeks assuming the accident of our meeting had proven something real. Sitting across from her in that moment, I wasn't nearly as certain anymore. "I've been sitting with a version of that same fear," I admitted, "just from the other direction. I keep wondering if I'm the man you actually chose, or just the convenient answer 2 families had already agreed on before either of us got a real vote." "That's not a comfortable thing to sit with either." "That's a fair thing to wonder," I said. "I've been sitting with something similar myself, honestly, though I hadn't fully found the words for it until just now." "What do we do about it?" "I think we go back to the bar. The actual stools, without either family knowing. See if what we felt that first night is still there, entirely separate from everyone else's expectations. That's either a very romantic idea or a slightly ridiculous one, possibly both. I contain multitudes, apparently, even when proposing slightly ridiculous romantic experiments. We did exactly that 2 nights later, sitting on the same 2 stools where this entire story had started, deliberately recreating the conditions of that first accidental hour without any of the accumulated pressure that had built up since. The bar looked almost exactly the same. Same dim lighting, same slightly too loud music from the speaker near the door, same bartender who glanced our way with the specific recognition of someone who remembered a memorable evening. "This feels different," Wren admitted, turning her drink slowly on the bar top. "Quieter. No audience this time. Good different or concerning different?" "Good, I think. I don't feel like I'm performing anything right now. I just feel like I'm sitting next to someone I genuinely like, the same way I did the first time, before either of us knew the other person had a name our mothers had already picked out for us. For what it's worth, that's exactly how I feel too. I don't think the arrangement invented anything that wasn't already going to happen. I think we would have found our way to each other eventually, even without 2 over-eager mothers accelerating the timeline. That's a generous interpretation of 2 women who've turned our entire relationship into a competitive sport. I'm trying it out, see if it fits better than the frustration." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us letting the familiar space work its own quiet magic, stripping away 3 weeks of accumulated pressure until what remained felt considerably closer to that first accidental hour than anything that had happened since. Wren was quiet for a long moment, studying me with the same evaluating stillness I remembered from that very first conversation. "Can I tell you something honestly? The night we met, before I knew who you were, I meant what I said. I wish it were you. I'd spent the whole week dreading meeting some stranger my mother had picked out, and some small, hopeful part of me was already wishing the actual date could somehow turn out to be someone I'd choose myself instead. I just didn't expect the universe to grant that wish quite so literally. I've been sitting with something similar since that first night, honestly. I think I fell for you before I even knew your name, which either makes this the most romantic story either of us will ever tell, or the strangest. Maybe it's both." "Probably both. I contain multitudes, apparently, even in matters of accidental romance." The kiss that followed started careful, the specific careful of 2 people finally closing the distance between an accidental first meeting and everything that had grown from it since. Then it went warm, her hand finding the front of my jacket, pulling me closer with a certainty neither family pressure nor 3 weeks of overthinking had managed to erase. And then, for one long, unhurried moment, it went past warm entirely into something that made those same 2 bar stools feel like exactly the right place for this story to properly resolve itself. We broke apart to the sound of the bartender, the same one who'd witnessed our original conversation 3 weeks earlier, clearing his throat with visible amusement. "You two are the couple from the blind date mix-up, right?" he said. "I remember. Never seen 2 people so confused about their own dinner reservation." "That's us," Wren said, laughing. "Still working through it, apparently, 3 weeks later. For what it's worth," the bartender added, "you both looked considerably happier tonight than you did that first night." Just an observation from someone who watches a lot of first dates. We told our mothers the full story shortly after that, the accidental hour at the bar, the mutual dread, the strange coincidence that had actually made the whole thing work. Both women reacted with a level of smug satisfaction that neither of us found remotely surprising. "I told you my matchmaking instincts were undefeated," Wren's mother said, at the dinner where we finally revealed everything. "I didn't even need to be there for the actual magic to happen. That's how good my instincts are. You take entirely too much credit for something you accidentally caused rather than deliberately engineered," Wren told her, though the affection in her voice undercut whatever protest she'd intended. A year later, we got married, and the napkin, the badly drawn textile sketch from that very first hour, before either of us knew who the other person was, sits framed now in our shared apartment. A small, permanent record of the exact moment a throwaway compliment turned out to be considerably more prophetic than I'd ever intended it to be. The wedding itself was small, held in the garden of the same museum where Wren worked, surrounded by the historical textile collection she'd spent years curating, a detail she insisted on despite her mother's initial preference for a considerably grander venue. "I want to get married somewhere that actually means something to me," she'd said, when the venue debate came up. "Not somewhere that looks impressive in photographs. This garden is where I go to think clearly. It seemed like the right place to make the biggest decision of my life." Our mothers, predictably, spent most of the reception competing for credit in front of increasingly weary relatives, each one insisting her own matchmaking genius had been the decisive factor in bringing us together, neither willing to concede that the actual mechanism of our meeting had involved a level of accident neither of them could take any real credit for. "I want it on the record," Wren's mother announced during her toast, "that I knew, the second I heard Julian's mother describe her son, that this was going to work. My instincts are simply never wrong about these things." She conveniently leaves out the part where we met at a bar an hour before either of us knew we were meant to be sitting at the same reserved table, Wren whispered to me, laughing quietly behind her glass. According to her version, her matchmaking worked exactly as planned, no accidents involved whatsoever. I've stopped correcting the record. I think both mothers have decided their own narrative is simply the official one now, regardless of what actually happened. I got to see Wren handle real pressure again, professionally, about 8 months into our marriage, when a delicate 17th century textile she'd been restoring for a major exhibit developed an unexpected structural issue days before the opening. I happened to be at the museum dropping off lunch when the crisis unfolded, and watched her transform instantly into a version of herself I recognized from that very first bar conversation about her work. Calm, focused, working through the problem with the same patient, exacting care she brought to everything that actually mattered to her. "You're terrifyingly good under pressure," I told her, once the crisis had passed and the piece had been stabilized in time for the opening. "I've been doing delicate restoration work for nearly a decade, Julian. Panicking doesn't help fragile fabrics survive an emergency stabilization. Somebody has to stay steady, and it might as well be the person actually holding the needle. I don't think you know how to do anything halfway. You should see me attempt simple home repairs. Deeply, embarrassingly halfway on that front. Still the worst drawing I've ever received from a romantic prospect," Wren likes to say, whenever the framed napkin comes up in conversation. "And somehow still my favorite one. High praise, given the extremely low bar my artistic skills apparently cleared." Our mothers still argue, 3 years later, about which of them actually deserves credit for the match, a debate that has become its own permanent fixture of family gatherings, each woman insisting her own contribution was the decisive factor in an arrangement that neither of them, strictly speaking, actually orchestrated correctly, given that we met each other entirely by accident before either mother's careful planning ever had the chance to take effect. The bartender who witnessed our original conversation still works at that same bar, and we return every year on our anniversary, sitting on the same 2 stools, ordering the same drinks we'd had that first night, a small, deliberate ritual that's become one of our favorite traditions. Same table request every year, the bartender said, on our 3rd anniversary, setting down our drinks with the specific familiarity of someone who'd watched this particular story unfold from the very beginning. I still tell new hires about the couple who got engaged to the wrong person right before meeting the right one, sitting at these exact stools. We didn't get engaged to the wrong person, Wren corrected, laughing. We just had 2 overeager mothers who nearly ruined a perfectly good accident with too much enthusiasm. Same story, better ending, I'll take it. My sister still brings up that phone call occasionally, usually with the specific satisfaction of someone who correctly diagnosed a problem before the person living through it could see it clearly himself. I basically talked you into this marriage, she likes to tell people at family gatherings, an exaggeration Wren finds endlessly entertaining and has never once bothered to correct. She really didn't, I tell people every single time. She just asked one good question at exactly the right moment. I did the rest of the work myself, eventually, once I let myself actually sit with the answer. Same difference, my sister always says. I'll take the credit either way. Wren's mother, for her part, has recently started a new campaign of taking credit for our eventual children, insisting her genetic contributions to the family tree will be equally responsible for whatever comes next. A claim that has become its own running joke at every subsequent family gathering. Both mothers now competing over territory that hasn't even technically been established yet. I give it another year before she starts naming names, Wren said after the most recent family dinner where the subject had come up yet again. She's already got opinions apparently about what constitutes a properly matched name for whatever children we eventually have. I contain multitudes, apparently, including a seemingly infinite tolerance for our mother's ongoing competitive enthusiasm about our entire life trajectory. That tolerance is going to be tested considerably further before either of them runs out of milestones to claim credit for. I'm prepared for the long haul. I signed up for the whole chaotic family experience the night I complimented a stranger at a bar who turned out to already be exactly who I was supposed to meet. I think about that first sentence sometimes, the throwaway compliment I offered a stranger mostly to fill an anxious silence before my own dreaded obligation began. I had no idea, saying it, that I was accidentally describing my future wife before I even knew her name. No idea that the small kindness would turn out to be the truest thing I said that entire evening. Wren says the same about her own accidental confession, that some part of her had already known, before either of us had any actual evidence, that the wish she'd whispered without meaning to say out loud was going to come true in a way neither of our mothers could have planned quite as precisely as they liked to claim. What would you have done if the stranger you complimented at a bar turned out to be the exact person your family had already chosen for you? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.